early 1990s, the apartheid system of government was the rule of the law in South Africa. As you undoubtedly know, the apartheid system of government meant that the white minority in South Africa had virtually all of the power, while the black majority simply had to take the abuse and harassment that was heaped upon them. One example of that was one day when some white South Africans decided that they wanted to send in some bulldozers to knock down the homes of some poor black people in one particular neighborhood. Under the apartheid system, those poor blacks really didn't have anyone that they could appeal to. There was no judge that they could turn to who would listen to their pleas and who would respond and step in and do what was right and save their homes. In fact, most of their black neighbors looked at their situation and figured that they didn't have a prayer. But even though they knew that the deck was stacked against them, some women who lived in that neighborhood did what they figured was virtually the only thing they could do to save their homes. And so, as those bulldozers got closer and closer to their neighborhood, those poor black women went out and stood in the middle of the street, right in the path of those bulldozers. And as the bulldozers got close, those women stood there and took off their clothes and stood there naked. The bulldozer operators were so embarrassed and ashamed by what they did that they immediately turned their machines around and left. And that neighborhood continues to stand to this day. Once upon a time, Jesus said, there was a woman, a poor woman, who lived in a certain town. And someone, presumably a wealthier, more powerful man, had taken advantage of her in some way, maybe by swindling her out of the little bit of money that she had. But when that woman, that widow, went to the local judge to file her complaint, the judge told her to beat it, to scram. Now, we need to understand that, especially in Jesus' day, blowing off a widow like that just wasn't done. In fact, according to the religious law of that day, a judge was supposed to immediately stop any other trial he was conducting so that he could hear a complaint from a widow or an orphan. That was because in that day, widows and orphans were considered to be the poorest and most vulnerable members of their society, since they didn't have anyone to stand up for them and to look out for their interests. In the case of widows, the problem was that when the husband died, any money or property he had did not pass to the widow, as usually happens today. Instead, according to the law of that day, when the man died, any money or property he had would pass to one of his male relations, to one of his sons, or to one of his brothers. And so, almost always, if a woman became a widow, that meant that she was condemned to living out the rest of her days in poverty. But even though most of the people there in that town probably figured that that widow didn't have a prayer with that judge, she didn't give up. Every day she stood outside his courtroom and banged on the locked doors and called out, "Give me justice! Give me justice!" She would follow the judge out onto the golf course, and whenever he was ready to putt, she would scream, "Give me justice! Give me justice. And when she found out where the judge lived, she would go and stand out on the sidewalk in front of his house, and every night at midnight she would holler, "Give me justice! Give me justice!" Well, finally, after that widow kept that up week after week, bothering that judge like crazy and shaming him in public, the judge said to himself, "I can't take this anymore. I don't give a hoot about this widow or her complaint, but she's making me look bad. Everywhere I'm going, she's embarrassing me. I can't take it anymore." And so the next morning, the judge had that widow come into his courtroom. And before she even had a chance to tell her side of the story, the judge hammered down his gavel and said, "I don't care what happened. You win. Judgment for the widow. Case closed." When you think about it, this is one of the stranger parables that Jesus told. But at the beginning of this parable, Luke tries to at least give us a hint to what Jesus is conveying through this story, when Luke says that Jesus told this parable to his disciples so that they might pray always and not lose heart. So maybe part of what Jesus is inviting us to see through this parable is that, like with that widow, even if our requests are not always granted all at once, we need to hang in there and keep asking. We need to hang in there and keep praying. For example, some years ago, Mother Teresa was trying to raise millions of dollars to build a facility in Washington, D.C. for people who had AIDS. And so one of the people that Mother Teresa planned to visit in order to get a donation was Edward Bennett Williams, a very wealthy Washington lawyer who at one time had owned the Baltimore Orioles baseball team and the Washington Redskins football team. Williams knew in advance why Mother Teresa was coming to see him, but he didn't feel comfortable having his money used for an AIDS ministry. But he told Mother Teresa that he would be glad to make out a nice big check to any other project that she might have. In that case, Mother Teresa said, "Let us pray." And so Mother Teresa bowed her head and prayed silently for what seemed to be like an eternity to Edward Bennett Williams. Finally, Mother Teresa looked up and said, "As I was saying, I am here today to ask your support for his AIDS hospice." Well, at that point, Edward Bennett Williams knew that he had been beat. And so he took out his checkbook and asked her how much she wanted. Just like that widow in Jesus' parable, Mother Teresa was persistent with her requests, and in time, her persistence was rewarded. And persisting in prayer certainly does seem to be one of the themes that Jesus is teaching through this